All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from, and welcome to our session today on climate change and the future of green jobs. My name's Zach Wagman, and I'm the Senior Green Jobs Manager at Project Learning Tree Canada and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. A little bit about the two organizations that I work for. Our vision is a world that values and benefits from sustainably managed forests. One of the ways we approach this from the SFI side is to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaborations. We do this through four main pillars of our work, which include our certification standards, our conservation research, our community engagement, and our environmental education. From the Project Learning Tree Canada side of things, we work to grow a diverse and resilient workforce in the green jobs sector. We do that through our Green Jobs in Green Spaces program, where since 2018, we've helped place youth in over 3,500 jobs right across Canada. There's a wide diversity of jobs that we've supported, everything from conservation and research, Indigenous forest-based programs, forest products operations, and jobs within the territorial and provincial park systems. So there is a lot of job opportunity in the green job sector, and there's also a lot of diversity in the young people that are filling these jobs. We're proud of achieving gender balance in our job placements year over year, as well as supporting over 500 Indigenous youth from over 80 different nations across Canada. A lot of our success wouldn't be possible without our fantastic network of employers that we work with. These include the Canadian Parks Council, as well as employers within our extensive Sustainable Forestry Initiative network, and our Indigenous employers that we work with. All of this comes together with our ability to build leaders in green jobs. All of these future green jobs leaders deal with climate change in one way, shape, or form. And it impacts the work that they do now, as well as the work that they're going to do in the future. And today, we've got a really great lineup of speakers to talk about exactly that. We'll be learning about how climate change is incorporated into their daily tasks and how it's going to change the future of their work. Our first panelist is my colleague, Darren Sleep. He's the Senior Director of Conservation Science and Strategies at the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Darren helps to manage SFI's growing conservation science credentials by increasing our capacity to develop and manage conservation projects in Canada and the United States. And I will hand it over to Darren.
Thank you, Zach. Now, if I can just make my presentation pop up the way I want it to look, we will be all set. How about that? Tell me, do you see my screen, Zach?
Yep, I do.
Perfect. Thank you, Zach. Thanks for the opportunity to present at this panel, and thank you very much for the organizers who brought us in for this. I'm looking forward to a great discussion with the folks in attendance. So the title of my talk here, you can see, is From Caribou to Climate Change, Oh, the Places You'll Go. And really, that's kind of a, it's obviously a take on an old Dr. Seuss book, but when I think about my career with research and with ecology, it's really that this pitch you see of me. This is kind of at the height of when I was doing wildlife work, and I've since moved into a lot of stuff related to carbon and climate as a result of climate change. And I think that's really sort of thematic of not just this workshop, but my career in general. So, oh my goodness, that's jumped. Okay, Zach, can we just pause for a moment? Sorry, there is something very wrong here.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I'll catch up with you. Oh, that's all right. I can fix this. I really can. Here we go. Let's same title screen, different talk. Okay, now let's try that one more time. My bad. Okay, so again, caribou to climate change. So I've worked a lot on some wildlife species.
I think we lost Darren, but we can keep moving on here. Carrie, I'm wondering if you don't mind going next.
Sure, no problem, Zach.
All right, thanks, Carrie. So for our audience, Carrie McLavin is the Chief Executive Officer of the Forest Gene Conservation Association, and the FGCA is a not-for-profit organization that's unique in its focus on gene conservation, which is the foundation of resilient forests. Over to you, Carrie.
Awesome. All right, let's hope I can do this a little bit better than poor Darren over there. All right, how does that look? How does that look to you guys? Good?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. All right, before I start, I want to let everybody know that you can grab your cell phones right now and head to www.menti.com. It's right there on the screen. And there's a code there I want you to type in. So I have a little bit of an engaging presentation here and a couple questions for our attendees today. So hoping you can take a minute, hop on there. And the first thing I want to do is ask you all, what does 2070 look like to you? That's about 49 years from now. If you're 15 on the call, you're going to be 64. If you're 35, you're going to be 84 years old. We're going to do a little bit of a word cloud here. So I'm hoping you guys can participate in this. And for some of you, maybe you'll be retired and you'll be sitting on a nice porch overlooking a beautiful forest, or maybe you're going to be working and feed and in your old age, or maybe you're going to have grandchildren. It's okay if you guys aren't participating. Oh, we've got some participants. That's awesome. So things are going to be innovative and sustainable and beautiful. That's a really good one. Alive, dystopic, very interesting. Balanced, better. I like that one. Sustainable is sort of a persisting theme there. Retirement, someone picked up on that. Bleak, okay. Some people are scared about what the future is going to look like. Extremely hot. So anyways, this gives you a good idea of what people are expecting in 2070. And it's really not that far away, but it is something that in my job with the Forest Gene Conservation Association that I have to be thinking about as we inform practitioners in the forest industry and forest sector about how they can do something given 2070 and our changing climate, and how they can change or affect our forests. So as Zach said, I'm with the Forest Gene Conservation Association. My career, I'm fairly early in my career, and I actually was on the board of directors for this organization from a former one I was on. And you know, I just started to get a little bit of a passion for it. There was a fire there that was lit in me of tree seed. You know, I didn't learn it in school. It wasn't a course. And so it just became very interesting to me, and I pursued that. And I also had a lot of interest in climate change itself. And I wanted to have an impact, and I wanted to make an impact in the area that I live and work in. So the FGCA, I'm going to call it, is a nonprofit organization. We focus on tree seed management expertise. We do education and advocacy work, teaching practitioners about tree seed, climate change adaptation, and gene conservation. We also do climate change adaptation work, so research projects. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of those things. And yeah, and then species conservation, so at-risk species, specifically tree species. So this is the type of work we do in Ontario, Canada. So one thing is that, you know, we have genetics, gene conservation in our name. I am not a geneticist. I'll admit that every single day, but I work with a lot of people that know a lot about forest genetics. But I think what's important for everybody to understand is genes are just, you know, trees are accumulation of so much information. They have gathered information over millions of years about sites, about climate. And so they're adapted now to deal with these conditions that they're living in now. So as forestry professionals, or as people that work in and with trees, we need to understand that trees do this. And we also need to understand how to respect it and facilitate it, especially now that given climate change. So this is a really cool picture. It's from one of my colleagues that used to work at the National Tree Seed Center, or does work at the National Tree Seed Center. So these are all different types of tree seeds. All trees, just different seeds. Some contain their seeds in cones. Some are seeds that are carried through wind. and have that sort of developmental elements to it. Some are tasty for our furry friends to carry around and plant in the ground. Others are berries that birds eat and distribute throughout the forest. So all these trees have adapted to their conditions and based on their requirements for movement over the many, many millions of years that they've been inhabiting. So let's get back to Menti. I want to ask you all, why do you think that it is important to maintain genetic diversity in the forest? This is a beautiful, diverse forest here. If you go to Menti, there's a couple of answers. I want you to give a shot at it. So I'll give you a minute just to answer. Why is it important to maintain forest genetic diversity? And if you don't know what genetic diversity is, then just diversity. So in the lead right now, we have ecological resilience, lots of people answering all of the above. Evolutionary potential, economic potential is important. So those, maybe I'll give you a couple more seconds. Those who have said all of the above, you're completely right. Genetic diversity is important for ecological resilience, resilience in the face of climate change. We don't know what's going to happen. So the more diverse forest we have, the better. Evolution potential, it gives the forest the ability to mate with lots of individuals to perpetuate more healthy individuals. Economic potential, you're going to get better quality trees that are going to be better for products that we get from the trees when sustainably managed. So I'm going to bring you here to Ontario, Canada, just to give you a glimpse of one area that we work in. This isn't all of Ontario, this is one perspective. So you can see on this landscape how we as humans have impacted the forests and how it is structured. So you can see over in the top right, there's, a larger block of forest. This is the fall in Ontario. We have beautiful colored leaves, but you can see there's different colors in there. So there's a diversity within there. Then you see this row right here in the middle where the odd tree popping up. So if you were a seed collector, what are you going to go for? Are you going to go and collect seed from this lone tree in the middle of the field? Or are you going to go collect seed from this diverse forest? What we're trying to do is educate people on that matter exactly, is collect from a diverse group of individuals to help propagate it. You also can see that our forests are fragmented. We don't really have continuous forests where seeds can slowly migrate. Given our changing climate, they have to make huge leaps when they move their seeds. So again, it's important things to notice about our forests and where they are at. So we also know that our forests are going to be subjected to more volatile climate conditions, extreme weather events, drought, all these types of things. This is actually a storm in Chatham, Kent, Ontario that was brewing up, and a weather reporter caught this amazing image. But, we have a lot of people that climate change is so variable. It's so random. So how can we actually even step in the right direction, begin to do the right thing? Whereas, a lot of the times we have a conversation with people and say, well, the risk of doing nothing at this point may actually be far worse than the risk of doing something. And so that tends to be the principles of our organization and how we're working. Another interesting fact, I guess, I want you guys to know about is that there have been papers that have studied how quickly species migrate across the landscape. So typically that has happened over millennia, millions of years that a species actually can physically move up. And usually, and this is tree species, this usually has happened at a rate of 100 meters per year. That's pretty fast if you think about trees. But given the fact that our climate is changing, temperatures are changing, our landscape is fragmented, we're now looking to expect trees to travel about 33,000 meters per year. It's a little bit daunting, and you can imagine the impact that could have. And so we as humans have to start thinking about how can we help influence this. If we're making our climate change this fast, we have to think about how can we help facilitate trees make this move so that we have resilient forests in 2070. So a glimpse into my world at the Forestry and Conservation Association. To tackle that problem, what we do is we work with the forest industry and forest practitioners across Ontario, and this is only part of our province here of Ontario, and then the United States is right here. The Great Lakes is this area right here. So up where the star is in the top left there, that's an area called Dryden, Ontario, and we were looking at where should we be sourcing tree seed to help increase the diversity of that forest in that area. And we're not talking about picking different species. We're talking about the same species, just getting seed from another area. And that way, when those seeds grow into trees, their pollen is spreading with all the local forests, and we're getting that mix of genetics that is going to be more resilient to climate change. So given the climate models, we applied those, and then what you see here in orange is the more suitable sources that we should be, or suitable locations for where we should be sourcing that seed for this location up here in Dryden, Ontario. So this is just one of the projects that we do to help support practitioners in making these climate change actions and steps. So I have a question for you all, back to Menti. You might have the questions in front of you right now, but how can you positively influence forestry and conservation? I've got a couple of answers up there, but I want to hear from you what you think. Is it through collecting seed, by planting trees, by managing forests sustainably, considering climate change, and all of that or more? Awesome. So you guys can clearly see that all of these answers are right, but what I want you to know that all activities in the forests have an impact on genetic conservation. Whether you cut a tree, whether you collect a seed, by planting a tree, when you manage a forest in a sustainable way, you can impact and influence forestry and conservation. When you consider climate change in your decision making as a forest practitioner, you can consider climate change. I had to add the music in, guys, like it was just necessary. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I really look forward to the breakout rooms and talking to you all about seed and climate change and what you can do. But I always encourage folks to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am, like you, a youth in the industry, and I am learning all the time, and I'm hoping to share some of my knowledge with you. So connect on LinkedIn, visit the Forestry and Conservation Association website. We have really great tools. We have a seed collection manual that is really great resource if you're learning how to collect tree seed and conserve forest genetics. So visit us and look forward to chatting with you later.
Thanks for that, Carrie. I'm curious what you think Canada's forest genetic diversity will look like in the future.
That is a very good question. Well, I mean, my greatest context is here in Ontario, and we have a very populated region of Canada. We are probably the highest population percentage in the smallest area in Canada, and we've had a significant impact on the quantity of forests, especially in Southern Ontario. So I think there needs to be a lot of action, both at the political level, the sector level, to try to conserve quality forests that we have, augment them, and then also in the forest industry to start to implement climate change adaptation projects to create that resilience. But I mean, I think the future looks positive, Zach, because there is this, climate change movement finally that people are starting to understand. And I think the more easily accessible this type of information is for folks, they might be able to take a little bit more action. I think those small wins everybody having small wins will lead to a bigger change.
For sure. I completely agree with that. Thanks again, Carrie.
No problem.
Darren, I see you're back online. So do we want to try sharing your screen again?
Let's see what happens. It worked so well the first time, didn't it? You have to enable me to share.
Carrie, I think you might just need to stop sharing your screen first.
You'll still have to let me share. Because I logged out and logged back in, right?
There you go.
Ah, perfect. All right, let's try this again. Am I still with you?
So far, so good. It's just loading
Sure.
on my end.
Okay.
But I think you froze again. So in that case, I think we'll move on to Lauren. If that's all right with you, Lauren. For everyone else on the call here today, Lauren Cooper is the program director at the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. Lauren has experience in forest carbon project development and wood utilization linkages to sustainability.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm just finding the right presentation and not do. Oh, is Darren back up?
I think he's still frozen.
Okay. I think I'm in middle of taking over his screen. Okay. This should work. All right. So I will share mine. Okay. Is that coming in correct? Full screen?
I've still got Darren's up on my end. I'm just trying to remove him here.
Oh, it's funny. It says I'm sharing. Maybe I'm not sharing.
There
right
we
now.
go.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let me reshare. All right. Does that look correct?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Really delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. As Zach mentioned, my name is Lauren Cooper. I direct the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program in the Forestry department at Michigan State University. So it's not very hard for me to make linkages to climate in my work, as it's basically what I talk about all day long. So I will walk you through a little bit of my background and share some of the activities that we do in the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program. My goal today would be to give you some ideas thinking about the career opportunities or what expertise you might want to think about acquiring now, and some paths to go forward with in your career, and just some of the unique career paths that are emerging specifically in this area. So a little more about me. You know my background already. I'm a social scientist. I'm actually a political ecologist and an environmental educator. I jokingly say I moonlight as a researcher in the Amazon because my role as a director of this program has taken up a lot of my time now, but I also do work in Peru and have spent a significant amount of time in that Amazon Andean regions. I speak Spanish. I also speak some Portuguese, and I've studied Quechua pretty extensively, but it's a very hard language, so I can't say I speak it. And I study climate change investments in forests and forest conservation, human decision making, and incentives. And these are kind of overarching themes that are not dependent on whether it's in Peru or here in Michigan. These are kind of broad themes that I'm interested in. To talk a little bit about my program, the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, which we call the FCCP, we put our program activities into these four bins. So some of the activities I'll share with you today cut across these four program activity areas, but we have formal education, non-formal ed, research and projects, and then stakeholder engagement. And then our team is super interdisciplinary, so that's something that I would point out about this space that we're working in. There's a lot of opportunity here, so you don't even have to be a forester to engage in this space. And in fact, we have a lot of people coming through our training programs that are either strong in one area. So we have people that are working in policy and they're designing, cap and trade programs or thinking about incentive programs, but they have no idea where the measurements are coming from out of the forest and how to calculate carbon. We have other people that are foresters, but they were never trained to do forest measurements and the calculations to calculate carbon. So they've been doing more timber cruises and looking at other indicators of forest health. So that's another area. We have other people that are in international relations. and finding themselves working on climate change portfolios and forests being a dominant theme. So we're finding this as a very interdisciplinary space. Our team is very interdisciplinary here in the FCCP. So we do everything from we have everything from the more physical forestry expertise, but a big challenge on the communication of these topics. So they're, can tend to feel kind of complex or data heavy, but one of our main missions is communicating the core ideas in a concrete and intuitive way so that more people can engage with them. Because we do want everyone from like a city council level decision maker to a national level RED Plus program manager to be able to talk about the core principles in a similar way. So I'm going to give a few examples of some of our types of training and engagement to show you what I work on. A couple of years ago, we got a grant, and I just found that there was a really big gap around forest carbon training. There was nothing specifically on forest carbon at the time. And so we got a grant to create a short course called Understanding Forest Carbon Management. And this is a professionally oriented course. So but it's very interdisciplinary. So we don't expect people to come in with background knowledge. And what we're finding is that people come in with some background, but you can't assume that it's the same background as someone else. So we kind of walk through a lot of the core ideas. We touch on the basic physical science, the policy considerations, what are these forest carbon projects people are talking about, management for forest carbon and measurements. So really kind of laying the foundational themes that we think someone needs to know to be able to engage in the topic area. We also host a monthly webinar series. So this is a great point of engagement if you'd like to engage with the FCCP. These are completely free webinars. I think we've been hosting them for like 3.5 years now. So we also have lots of previous recordings that are available for review at any time. So just want to highlight this as a place you can sign up. We only have one left in the series since actually Darren will be participating. But these are resources, and we will be planning and announcing the upcoming year as well. So if you're interested in forests and climate, we'd love to have you join our series. Another resource to point out is we have an open resource library, and these are all completely free resources that are available on our website. We have everything from an interactive module, which is basically like a mini version of our short course. It takes about 20 minutes to walk through. We have a lot of unique graphics and slides that we've designed, so you're welcome to download and include them in any presentations that you're doing. And we also have a series of field videos and forest carbon measurements. So we created these for our short course, but we've made the videos openly available afterwards. So it demonstrates measuring trees, taking the measurements, and how to actually go all the way through with carbon calculations. So you can find these again in our open resource library. And I think you can find the tree measurements from Googling. They're all hosted on YouTube if you can find your way to the MSU Forestry site. But they're all short, and I think actually very, very useful if you're interested in knowing how the carbon calculations are actually acquired. And then I just wanted to provide a couple more snapshots of current activities, just to show you the range of topics that I'm working on in this carbon and climate space. And I will say I'm really delighted by the types of topics I get to work on. And again, it's really interdisciplinary, so I am not I never know everything on the project. There's always different types of expertise coming in. There's policy, there's forestry experts, wildlife experts that have to come in. I'm more on the human side and human decision making, and again on that environmental education. So this project is through USAID. We have a new partnership to work with US Forest Service in Peru to create a new Spanish language e-course. So it's going to kind of be our Understanding Forest Carbon Management course, but in Spanish and geared towards tropical forests. We're going to have 100 Peruvian professionals go through, and then afterwards, we're going to convert this to a general Latin American oriented Spanish course, so diversify the examples. And we're partnering with some of the major actors in Peru, so it's a really great opportunity to pivot. Our current course is a little more domestically oriented, and this is a great opportunity for us to pivot internationally. So we're really, really excited about this. We also have a project to expand our Understanding Forest Carbon Management course into regional modules in the United States. So we're currently doing deep dive modules on the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Pacific Northwest. We're doing some analysis with FIA data, so we'll be putting out a number of really great graphics and figures into our open resource library and doing a deep dive on climate impacts and management interventions in these areas. So pretty excited about this. As kind of, I felt like at the end of our Understanding Forest Carbon Management course, provides the background, but then it's we need to take it another step to help inform decision making. And we're also in a carbon modeling project right now. We have some funding in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance. We're working currently in 5 states, and we're modeling landscape carbon 100 years into the future. So it's an aspatial model that looks at different forest cover types and models them out into the future. And we're working directly with DNR type partners in all the states. And it looks like we're expanding into 2 states out west as well, to help them think about what types of practices do they want to be promoting now, and what will that mean for forest carbon on the landscape into the future. So currently, for example, Michigan is a net is a carbon sink. So we are in the right direction for carbon. We're a carbon sink. But what do Michigan leaders need to be thinking about now to ensure that Michigan remains a carbon sink into the future, that we don't become a source? And this is really important for states like our state here, Michigan, that has a carbon neutrality target. So it's aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. And that points to some, it's going to have some offsetting from natural and working lands, because we are not going to be carbon, I'm sure fossil fuel free by that time. So there's a lot of kind of big ambitions, but we're helping to connect the dots in terms of the data points as well. And then a couple more projects that are related. These are kind of a broader umbrella of looking at safeguards and climate smart forestry. So we have 2 related projects. One, we're looking at safeguards for a sustainable forest bioeconomy. And so this idea is looking at, if you're going to assert that forest products are climate smart, what are the safeguards you need to have in place to ensure that there's no negative environmental or societal impacts? So the first project's looking at this really broadly and different types of tools, including certification. And then that links tightly with our next project, which is actually with SFI, that's assessing this notion of climate smart forestry, which is a theory, but it doesn't have a lot of structure to it yet. Whereas we have a lot of great tools like certification that has a lot of structure. So we want to look at how are these aligned, and how can we leverage the tools that we already have to move us towards thinking about climate change and climate smart actions in a more strategic and quantifiable way as well. And then just really quickly, a couple of opportunities. I wanted to highlight some careers. So these are groups that we work with or have sent people through our program or send us jobs. And so also we have a monthly webinar, our monthly newsletter, quarterly newsletter that we'd love to have you sign up if you're interested. We get a lot of job opportunities. We put them into our newsletter. So if you're interested in that, I'll post the email address to sign up for it. It's forestc@msu.edu, but I can put that in the chat in a moment. But really wide range of actors are finding themselves in need of more carbon and climate expertise. Like actually just recently, a big flurry of job opportunities. Every TNC, the Nature Conservancy, just sent some opportunities along, a lot of state level opportunities, government. So really exciting to see all of the opportunities that are coming along, and they're asking us for recommendations of folks. So we're definitely looking for a supply of talent in this area. And I just wanted to highlight one particular job. This was a forest carbon analyst with Blue Source. So they reached out to us, and we're really looking for someone who had some experience, but could really learn on the job as well. So these are kind of new types of opportunities, new types of experience that they're looking for, so that it's hard for them to find people that are very experienced, because these are kind of newer positions. So just to put that out there, if you're looking and thinking about your career options, that there seems to be a lot of work in this space. And so again, I mentioned this briefly, we have our newsletter, we highlight webinars, articles, job opportunities. We also have our webinars and our open resource library. And then if there's other opportunities to collaborate, we'd love to hear from you. So short writing pieces, funding opportunities we share information about. We are looking also at establishing internships. So we'd love to hear from you. And again, I'll drop our contact email in the chat. Oh, I have it right here. Yes. forestry@msu.edu. That's it for me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Lauren.
Yeah.
What role do you think forest products and wood products will have in the future with respect to mitigating climate change?
Huge. So, I think it's people are just starting to really get their mind wrapped around it, but truly, to address climate change, we have to disinvest from fossil fuels and invest more in our natural resources. So, there's a big effort to plant trees. That's not going to be enough. We actually need to incorporate renewable resources throughout our whole economy. So while we need to increase carbon stocking, increase our forest areas, we also need to increase sustainable wood use and production. There's all sorts of creative ways to do that, everything from leveraging waste material from urban areas to expanding use of certified products to ensure that you're getting the climate benefits. But really, we really need kind of a bigger economic shift away from fossil fuels, and our sustainable wood products do offer that path. And then just one final point I often say on this is that I think it's helpful to think of a landscape approach so that we're careful we don't want to have conversion of natural forests, but that we want to promote this idea of having different values across a landscape. So you can have your highly managed, production forests, you can have your protected areas that have different set of values to them in terms of the carbon sequestration rates or carbon storage. So it doesn't have to be an either or, it's an and. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we're really just kind of starting to get our minds wrapped around how far we can really go to promoting a bioeconomy.
For sure. And it's definitely a collaborative approach in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Lauren. Our next speaker is Ashley Cobble. Ashley is a forest watershed scientist at the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement and has research experience that spans terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Over to you, Ashley.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to start by providing some information on my background. I'm an aquatic ecologist and biogeochemist. I have extensive experience. I've listed sort of my academic background here, but I have extensive experience working in a variety of aquatic systems. And all of these experiences are focusing on things like water quantity, water quality, and how those things are affecting our aquatic food webs. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on three general areas that sort of overlap with my current position. In my current job with Nikazi, my role is to understand the effects of forestry activities on our freshwater ecosystems. And so a big part of that is looking at some of these components. So if we look at the first one of these in terms of snowpack, we do know that climate change is expected to alter snowpack through a variety of ways. So one is that it can affect the type of precipitation that's received. So if we think about increasing air temperatures, so when you're near that transitional temperature, you can shift from snow to rain in some areas. So this could be at elevational gradients, or this could be seasonal changes, so closer to the shoulder seasons of transitions from fall to winter or from winter to spring. Similarly, we expect shifts in the amount of snowpack as well as the timing of snowpack. So that's the overall duration, but also the timing of snow melt. And ultimately, that timing of snow melt has the potential to then interact with some of these other components like seasonal flow changes overall. So we do know that climate change is going to affect these hydrological components, which can be pretty important parts of the hydrograph in some locations. And so we often get questions from foresters wanting to know, okay, what do we know about the effects of forest harvest on snowpack? And so this is a fact sheet that we developed this past year to help address some of these questions. And so whenever we have these questions, of course, the first step is to review the literature, and then the next step is to understand whether or not we need to engage in additional study to try to identify some of the nuances of these responses. So another important topic recently has been seasonal flow changes. And so here in the Pacific Northwest, both the US and Canada, A major issue is thinking about summer low flow. And so in this region, summer is characterized by very dry periods of little to no precipitation. And so that's a period that coincides with the growing season when vegetation utilizes a lot of water, but it's also a time period when the native salmonids that live in these streams, they require cold water. And so we're very concerned about water temperatures increasing during these periods. And so understanding how this low flow component changes is very important. Climate change is expected to reduce the summer low flow component, and analyses of water gauges throughout the region have shown that there's a declining trend in the low flow component here regionally. And also there's a change in earlier stream flow timing, which of course relates back to some of those snowpack dynamics as well. So in terms of how forestry then also affects that component, we know at annual timescales we have hundreds of paired watershed studies that have really that have identified what those effects are, and we know that there's an increase in surface runoff and an increase in surface water following forest harvest. So that's if you remove much of that overstory vegetation, then you're going to have an increase in flow in most cases, and that's by also reducing some of these other important components of the water budget. So that's sort of the expectation based on annual scales, but you can also see similar responses on seasonal scales. So this is an image taken from our review paper that was recently published, where we reviewed the literature that had studies of at least 10 years or more of data following a forest harvest and looking at the seasonal component. And so we do still see that initial increase after a harvest, as you would expect with an annual flow. But then in the longer time period, you can either have no change or you can even have a decline. And so these are important things to understand, because some in the literature, some have suggested that if there's a decrease as a consequence of climate change, then potentially this increase as a consequence of forest could help offset those changes. But of course, it's not so simple as to look at just the first 5 years, but we also need to understand how these longer term trajectories are also influencing our hydrological budgets. So as a result, we really focus on understanding how some of these other components like forest stand age, how is that affecting things at different scales? So at smaller watershed scales versus at larger watershed scales, these can have different responses. And so in our review paper, which I co-authored with many hydrological experts from a variety of fields, we explore some of these questions of what is the role of forest stand age? What's the role of riparian buffers, and how does thinning or changes in stand density potentially affect some of these low flow components? And many of these are still unknown and are places where we're identifying a need for active areas of research. And then the third component I want to talk about is extreme climate events. So we know that climate change is expected to increase the frequency, intensity, and even duration of some of these extreme climate events. But it's also important to acknowledge, of course, that extreme climate events are also part of the natural regime in many locations. And so I just want to highlight a few examples of things that I've had opportunities to study, including floods and fires. And we can study these events when they happen to get a better understanding of how climate change may alter our ecosystems in the future. So as part of my postdoc in New Hampshire, I studied 2 back-to-back 100-year flood events that occurred in southeastern New Hampshire. Our monitoring station, this USGS gauge, is located here where this black dot is, and then immediately downstream of that, this watershed exports into Great Bay. Great Bay is listed as nitrogen impaired, and so a big component of our research was understanding how do these 2 subsequent flood events then alter watershed export of things like nitrogen, but we were also interested as well in base cations or salts because of the accumulation of salts or salinization of water in that area as well. So these are some images taken by a colleague of mine, Michelle Shattuck, that she shared with me. For those of you familiar with gauge houses, you can see this is the USGS gauge, and this is it was completely underwater. And this photo was taken after the flood started to recede, when you could actually get in to take a picture. In terms of the magnitude of these events, this is this figure is showing you discharge extending back from October 1st 1999 through 2015. You can see that in 2006 and 2007, the flow did exceed the benchmark as set by FEMA in their 2008 report to identify that these were in fact 100-year flood events. And so those occurred in May and then again in the following April. So it was actually twice within a single 1-year period, but both of which were occurring essentially during that snowmelt period. Additionally, I had an opportunity to also examine carbon and nitrogen export from along a Siberian wildfire gradient. And so here in the Central Siberian Plateau, there is a fire return interval of approximately 100 years. In this area of the Arctic, they're undergoing rapid climate change, and fire frequency is expected to increase in the future. Our Russian colleagues here had set up a very wonderful fire gradient that we can use to understand recovery of these ecosystems over time. And so if you look at this map, the red watersheds are those that burned most recently. And one of these, this N11 site was burned in 2013. So we actually had pre and post fire data from this particular watershed. And then the green ones are those that burned at least 100 years ago. We don't know the exact time of the prior fires, but those are essentially our reference watersheds in those systems. And so we recently published on some of this, and we found that there was decreased carbon export and increased nitrogen concentrations in those systems as a consequence of wildfire. A little closer to home and more related to my current position, I'm currently in Oregon and I oversee research throughout the Pacific Northwest, but here in Oregon, we've had a variety of studies ongoing. Unfortunately, some of our studies were recently impacted by the recent wildfires in the Oregon Cascades. This map is showing you 4 fire boundaries extending from north to south along Oregon. So it's a pretty extensive area that was burned as a part of these Labor Day fires. And these images are images that were taken within a month to 2 months following the fires, when we were able to re-enter some of these areas. So because there is high degree of mortality of overstory vegetation within these watersheds, we are very concerned about the water quantity coming out of this. And also there are major concerns about landslide risk and soil erosion that can contribute sediment to our stream channels. And so we have been working very quickly to get out and try to monitor the export of sediment from these systems. We're using auto samplers to collect storm events to get suspended sediment, but we're also looking at water levels and turbidity loggers that can help us identify some of that turbidity changes at finer timescales. So also we did have ongoing research at the time of the fires, and then we were able to retrieve our equipment, and it survived. Much of it did survive. So we do have data that shows air and stream temperature changes during those fires across a gradient essentially of percent that were encompassed by those burned areas. And so these are showing you our monitoring locations where we had temperature sensors throughout these stream reaches at the lowermost portion of these watersheds. And then the coloration here of the riparian zone just indicates the soil burn severity of some of those locations. So we have moderately burned, low severity burned, and unburned locations to compare some of those responses. So overall, we do find that it's important to understand how climate change is going to affect our hydrological systems. And of course, we have to consider those as we think about how to best manage our watersheds moving forward. Are there any questions?
Thanks for that, Ashley. With the speed at which climate change is increasing, I think this line of work is going to become more and more important. So I'm wondering what steps you would recommend to a young person if they were interested in pursuing this line of work.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities. So I spoke a little bit primarily about forest hydrology, and I think that yes, there are plenty of opportunities in forest hydrology, and particularly at there are opportunities at different agencies. There are opportunities with forest companies as well, where you can get into sort of this basic forest hydrology type of research. Some of the other work that I'm doing is associated more with aquatic biota and ecosystems. And, I think there too, there are very much increasing interest in monitoring programs through some of these state regulatory agencies, but also just generally from nonprofits and other organizations as well. So, I think you do need a solid background in one of those traditional, fish biology or hydrology fields, which would include a bachelor's and probably a master's and many, for many, to be competitive, I guess, for many of those positions.
Perfect. Thanks, Ashley.
Yep.
I see we have Darren back in here. So I think we'll try him presenting again. I will share the presentation from my end. So I'm just gonna share my screen here. And
third time's the charm, Zach. This is gonna work, I can tell. So thanks everyone for their patience. Brand new computer, apparently not getting along with Zoom very well. So that will be something that the tech support people have to help me with in the coming days. So as I said, or back when I was introduced way back, Darren Sleep, Senior Director of Conservation Science and Strategies with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. And I want to talk to you today about my evolution as a professional in the field I chose to go into and what I'm doing now, and how that has changed and how I've adapted with what has been needed. So let's go to the first slide, Zach. Okay, so once upon a time, I'm actually from the east coast of Canada. I'm from a province called New Brunswick. This is a lovely picture of sort of the landscape in the University of New Brunswick where I did my undergrad. And my undergraduate supervisor, Dr. Tony Diamond, with an Arctic tern sitting on his head. When I was coming up through high school and going into university as a young man, this species that you see here, this barred owl, this is the species that I first encountered in the woods and was enthralled with. And I'll be honest with you, to this very day, hearing an owl call at night just gets my blood pumping. I'm just fascinated and captivated all at once. And Dr. Diamond, when I was in my undergrad, really inspired me to look broadly and to explore the world around me broadly. I was actually quite willing to stay in New Brunswick and do my undergrad, then do my master's, and then keep working. And he was actually the person who encouraged me to leave and to get out and expand my horizons so that I would be more adaptable in my career. Next slide, Zach. So much to my surprise, I moved all the way out to this place called Regina in Saskatchewan. Now Saskatchewan is in the middle of the Great Plains of North America. It looks very much like a moonscape. It's flat, flat, flat. You can, as they say there, you can watch your dog run away for 5 days. It's an amazing place, but very, very different from what I grew up with. But fortunately for me, where I was doing my work, just click to the next bit there. I worked in this place called the Cypress Hills, and this is a biotic refuge right in the middle of the Great Plains. It's a granite outcrop that survived the glaciation and is forested to this day. So when you drive across the plains, it's very, very flat, and then you get to this really neat environment where you go up about 6,000 feet, which is roughly the elevation of some of the Rockies. In the middle of the prairies. It's this really, really cool place. And I worked there studying bats. Hit 2 more, I think, Zach. So I worked with this guy named Dr. Mark Brigham at the University of Regina, and worked at night again. So I'd gone from owls and then moving into working on bats. And I really got this deep training between these 2 gentlemen in wildlife ecology, very, very focused on nocturnal ecology in the forest, interesting stuff, but it wasn't really very broad, and I don't think I was very broad spectrum in how I thought about things. Next slide. When I finished my master's, I went on to the University of Guelph, where I worked with this gentleman, Dr. Tom Nuds. Now Tom was the guy who really broke me out of my thinking shell, if you will. He really got me thinking very broadly and expansively about ecology and research and where I might take my career. And none of us can really predict the future. But when I started working with Tom, I was really interested in doing something that people would care about. And I started working on these forested landscapes with the forest products sector, looking at how their management interacted with owls, as it turns out. So I was doing owl work again. And it was still focused on a very wildlife focused project, but it had this bigger element looking at an industry that is constantly changing and evolving and developing different practices. And I started really thinking very expansively about how I can think broadly and be more adaptable in both my career and in how I thought about stuff. Next slide. So much to my surprise, because I really had no idea where my career was going at that point, I was really deep into research. I was loving this work. So from the University of Guelph in Ontario, I moved to, and you just heard Ashley Coble speak from Nicasi, and I ended up working for Nicasi for about 12 years. I worked out of the Montreal office in Quebec, and I worked on a variety of wildlife species. And then, Ashley may be surprised to hear this, but I actually did some watershed research projects as well. So I was really expanding the work I was doing. And for the first time in my career, I found myself in what's called a boundary spanning position. I had 1 foot in the scientific world where I was doing research and 1 foot in the forester's world where I was thinking about the limitations and the challenges of doing forest management. And this was a fascinating time in my life. Initially, when I took the job with Nicasi, I really saw myself working there for maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. I ended up staying with them for 12 years. And it was truly a great time in my life where my career really grew and I became much more adaptable, thinking much more broadly. At the time, I worked in wildlife and biodiversity, so studying various species at risk and conservation, and a little bit of watershed management work, water quality and quantity. And thirdly, I worked in this sector called sustainable forestry and conservation planning, where I get to think about protected areas and how protected areas interact with managed forests and how to blend the two across the landscape. So this was a point in my career where I really started to adapt and to think broadly about ecology, about natural resources, about human use of forests, and how humanity integrates with forests. Next slide. So from Nicasi, about 3 years ago, I moved over to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and their conservation pillar, where they looked at me and they said, look, we know what you do with Nicasi, we like what you do, but we want you to do it bigger. So when I moved over to SFI, I started working on these 3 broad areas. Water, again, sort of the water quality and quantity, because we know water is very important, not only for wildlife and for growing plants, but for humanity in general. So it's a big important topic. Biodiversity, which is obviously my heart and soul, where I'd done a lot of my undergraduate, my graduate training, and much of my career had focused on biodiversity. But this third element that they were getting me to work on, carbon and climate change in the forest, was a real new thing for me to start focusing on. And I have to say that when I started with SFI 3, and it was only 3 years ago, my work was focused on biodiversity, but I've become more and more focused on carbon and climate as we've gone. And that's because we know that climate change has become a bigger and bigger issue that we're trying to grapple with, not just as the forestry sector, but as humanity as a whole. Also, at that time, when I moved over to SFI, my boundary spanning actually grew, because I'm no longer just dealing with scientists and foresters, but now I'm dealing with scientists, foresters, and civil society and environmental groups. So I really have been growing and growing, and my career has become bigger and more challenging as I've gone on. And this is really important when we think about some of the environmental issues we're dealing with. Next slide, Zach. So, we've talked about my day-to-day. What do I do on an everyday kind of work thing? So I sort of picked a bunch of keywords that I think I really focus on what I do. Number 1 is collaborate. I collaborate across not just industry, not just companies, but governments, consultants, academics. All 3 of the folks you've heard speak ahead of me, I've collaborated to some degree with all 3 of them. I also work to support the other pillars in SFI. So the conservation side of SFI provides information and feedback to the other pillars of SFI. So be it our standards, our education pillar, or our community pillar, we're always constantly reviewing material and giving them new scientific insights from papers. I also do some investigations. I'm involved with a number of research groups, so we actually do research and continue to publish papers. So there's just a handful of papers I threw up there. I do a lot of communication. So me speaking in front of you today, I speak in front of a lot of groups. Normally it's in person, of course, but since COVID has come around, we don't travel so much, so it's all on Zoom. So I do a lot of communications, both in terms of speaking as well as writing. And finally, I do a lot of educating. I often refer to it as adult educating, but I have to present to foresters and policymakers at provincial, federal, state levels to talk about science and to talk about how forestry integrates with science. Next slide. But really, the true, I guess for me, the biggest thing I do is collaboration and networking. So this is a slide where I put a bunch of organizations on here. These are all organizations that I would say I've integrated and collaborated with, actually, probably in the last 2 or 3 years. So a lot of these organizations I'm involved with on a regular basis. There are some of our very close partners, organizations we work with and have done a variety of projects with, and we continue to do. And really, as we try and take on the challenges of 2021 and beyond, we are going to have to increase our ability to collaborate. So when you're thinking about your career and where you want to go, the number one skill I think you need is networking. You need to be able to talk to people and connect with people and learn about people and understand their needs and help them understand your needs. So that's what collaboration and networking is all about. Next slide. So, but as I said, within my scope of work, the number one thing I deal with is carbon and conservation at SFI. Now, SFI has taken the challenge on of climate change and forest management very heavily. In the last, the last 4 or 5 years, we've invested almost $1 million Canadian. That's Canadian. So I guess in US dollars, that's probably about 800 million or so. 800,000. And that's been leveraged out to about 3 times that value. So that's other organizations coming alongside of SFI and saying, well, we see the money you're putting into stuff, we want to contribute as well. So we've done a lot of work with various partners on carbon and trying to understand the carbon footprint of forest management in North America and what that means globally for the rest of the world. Next slide. We know that and I think Lauren actually touched on this when Zach asked the question after her talk, we do need to increase and better understand the production of forest and forest products. We need to make sure that everything is sustainably sourced, but we also need to make sure that customers appreciate the value of managed forest and the products that come out of them. We know that consumers want to buy wood products from sustainably managed forests, and we know that consumers say that it's a good idea to buy paper and cardboard products from a sustainably managed forest. This is all about finding better ways to tackle climate change going forward. So we know consumers care about the environment. So how do we make sure that we're delivering products that are sustainably managed and benefit the environment at the same time? Next slide, Zach. At the core of our mission, at the core of what we believe at SFI is we believe that sustainably managed forests, holistically speaking, combat climate change. So it's all about having healthy, vigorous growing forests, having a healthy, vigorous forest product sector, using those products in sustainable ways, recycling them, putting them in long-lived products like cross-laminated timber and things like that, and really being conscious about where we're sourcing our fiber from, the carbon footprint of that sourcing, because we know there's always going to be some emissions. Again, as Lauren said, we need to reduce our fossil fuel dependence, but continue to produce these products that then get used appropriately and sustainably. Next slide. And when we think about how climate change is growing and affecting that forest, again, if we're going to get back to making sure that the products we are producing that will help us fight climate change, we have to make sure they're sustainably managed. We have to understand that feedback cycle from the climate to the forest and how can we do a better job. We know that the increasing temperatures of the globe have various effects on forests, and to be honest with you, at a location by location basis, we often don't know what those effects will be. But we know that in some places there's going to be forests that suffer because of lack of water. In other places, there's going to be increased fires. In other places, we're going to have new pest infestations like mountain pine beetle that come in, all as a result of climate change. So we have to think about how we manage the forest, and we need to adapt our practices. So one of the things that we're encouraging certified organizations, and when we say certified organizations, we mean companies that are managing their forests and want to be sustainable, and they are getting certified to SFI or any other certification for that matter. What we're asking our companies to do that are involved with our standard, we're asking them to sit down and very seriously assess how they expect climate change to affect their forest, to adapt their practices and their planning to help deal with those, as well as to mitigate some of climate change effects by, if possible, in any way possible, increasing the carbon sequestration going on in the land or increase the long-lived products that they're producing. Next slide. So one of the things we've done very recently, and I think Lauren also mentioned that Climate Smart Forestry is one of the projects that we're working with her organization on. But we developed a new standard, a new objective within our revised standard that was just revised this year and is now in the process of being finalized. We developed a Climate Smart Forestry objective. We know, again, we know that our forests play a critical role in addressing climate change. We know that there's this increasing global forest, as there should be on forests, and we think that this gives SFI particularly an opportunity to play this important role. In North America, we've got about 170 million hectares of land that's certified to SFI. That's a large chunk of real estate. If we can get forest managers to focus on climate and adapting to climate on that footprint, we think we can have a really good and positive effect on the fight against climate change. We already know that the standard prior to this past year addressed climate change through resiliency and reforestation and forest health. So we know there were some positive things going on, but we really felt with this revision, there was an important impetus to develop a new objective to really focus and double down our efforts on mitigating climate change and adapting our practices. Next slide. The objective has sort of a two-pronged approach. One is to do an assessment of the climate change risks so that companies better understand as their climate warms in their local area, what are the tools out there, what's the research out there, what's the data out there that can help them identify the risks to their forests. And then the second part of it is to identify opportunities. So the first part is figuring out what is likely to happen in your forest and adapting your management strategy around that, so that instead of trying to force the forest to do what you want, you develop your policies, your planning, and your harvesting approaches that goes along with how the forest is changing, so you can better manage. The second part is to identify these opportunities, to look for chances to improve climate mitigation. Can you improve climate related impacts? Can you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? Can you somehow find a way to increase the amount of carbon sequestration going on in your landscape? So again, this is a two-pronged. One is adapting to what's going to happen. The other one is making your forest better for the climate. Next slide. So how do we get there? We know that this is very much a wicked problem. And by wicked problem, in a business sense, we talk about wicked problems, it means that the data we have on them is incomplete. Sometimes the data is contradictory. One researcher will say one thing, the other one says something else. And often the understanding of the effects of climate change are changing as we go. So it's really important that we ask our organizations to be very adaptive and to seek out tools and people that can help. So they've got to really be open. Second, we've asked them to identify opportunities to act, finding ways to pivot. When the forest changes one way, you change with it. It's important that we do not focus on solving problems, because you're never going to solve the problem, but do focus on finding solutions. And finally, we ask to not focus on perfection, but focus on continual improvement, getting better as you go. What's interesting about all four of these things I've highlighted here is I would also say you can take these to the bank for your career. Be adaptive and seek out tools and people that can help you along the way. Identify opportunities for you to grow your career and to increase and think more broadly about what you do. Don't focus on getting to a destination, I'm going to achieve this, but just focus on what's the next solution and how do I continually improve my thinking and the way I approach my career and the way my career will benefit society. And with that, I think, Zach, I'm done. This is my contact information. I'm looking forward to talking to folks in the breakout rooms. rooms, and I do apologize again for the multiple attempts to give this presentation.
Thanks for that, Darren. Forestry seems to be a bit of a misunderstood sector. What's one thing that the general population doesn't know that you think they should know about forestry?
So there's a colleague of mine in, I think he's in Louisiana, and he's a forester and has been a forester his whole career. And one thing that he points out is it's very hard for the general population to get their heads around forestry because we are harvesting a high emotional quantity, a high emotional commodity rather, in trees, and we tend to produce low emotional commodities in the forms of corrugated boxboard, paper, and toilet paper. And what I think has to be understood is that forest management is a continually improving good thing that has a lot of great benefits for society, great benefits for the forest. As I've often said, a community does better if it's in the middle of a healthy forest, and a healthy forest does better if it's surrounding a healthy community. So there's a synergistic relationship there that I think is important to note. And just because a tree is cut down, that is not necessarily a bad thing.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Darren. And thanks to all our panelists for those excellent presentations. I know I took a lot away from those, and I hope our audience did as well. At this point of our session, we're going to move to the breakout room format. So we'll be setting up 4 different breakout rooms, and we'll have each of our panelists in one of them. And we'll have about 10 minutes in each breakout room before we rotate our panelists from one room to the other. It'll give you a chance to ask those questions and connect a little bit further with them. So we'll just be setting that up. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed those breakout sessions and that you were able to ask those questions that you had. On behalf of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and Project Learning Tree Canada, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their days to present and speak with everyone, and also to all our attendees. Thanks for joining us here today on our session on green jobs and the future, on climate change and the future of green jobs. We hope you enjoy the rest of the Global Youth Summit. Thanks.